Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for the 6th session of the Spring 2026 SunoikisisDC Digital Classics semester. This session is, this semester's topic is digital approaches to cultural heritage. And today in particular, we're talking about working with Indigenous heritage. I'll say a few more words about that in a moment. Just to quickly say hi and welcome to anyone who's watching us live. If you are watching us live, please feel free to use the live chat feature, which should be on the right of the video or underneath the video, to let us know you're here and where you're watching from. Greetings also if you're watching this later at any time in the future. We intend this video to remain online, but obviously, we can't see your comments live if you do, if you are joining us later. But I think we'd all love to hear from you if you have any particular pressing questions or comments at a later time. If you found this video through YouTube rather than through the SunoikisisDC program, then you might like to know that below the video, if you expand the description of the video, there is a link to a session page for this session, which has outlined some suggested readings, some other resources, and in particular an exercise that we will also talk about a little bit at the end that you might like to work on. And the slides for this session will also be downloadable. I was about to say they are downloadable, but I've just noticed that they're not there. They'll be downloadable in 5 minutes. I'm going to put the link in very shortly. Yes, the speakers today for this session, who you can see them all on the screen. Paula Rauhala from the Sami Museum, Paula Granados García from the Endangered Material Knowledge Program, and Nicole from the University of Ottawa are going to introduce various topics and case studies in the theme of today's topic. We'll also ask them to introduce themselves briefly at the beginning of their presentation to say a little bit about what their academic or intellectual or heritage background is and that they're bringing to this, and we'll see these topics sort of expand. I did want to just say as a couple of words that while certainly I think probably most people who watch the SunoikisisDC program, and certainly my students and probably Chiara's students are from either a classics or in any case a sort of European or Mediterranean antiquity background. The issues we're talking about today, the issues that come up in things like the care principles that we'll be hearing a bit about and so forth, about respect for heritage, respect for the communities whose heritage we're studying, all of those issues are also relevant to a greater or lesser degree if you're studying 2,000-year-old Roman heritage. You still have to think about what you're studying, why you're studying it, how you're talking about it, whether you should be looking at it in certain ways and so forth. So I think all of these things are, obviously we're talking about Indigenous heritage, and all of the things we're talking about are specific to different kinds of Indigenous heritage. But they will also be questions that you should be asking yourself with reference to other kinds of heritage. We'll also we'll be hearing very quickly today that there is no one single answer to what is the correct way to deal with Indigenous heritage, because there are as many different answers as there are different Indigenous communities and groups whose heritage might be under discussion. But it's really a question of respect and of making sure that the communities themselves are represented in the decision making and the research that we're doing. So I think I will, having said that, I will pass immediately on to our three speakers who unlike me know what they're talking about, and will introduce the topic in more detail. And I believe that Paula Rauhala is going to start us all off.
Hi everyone, First, I want to say thank you to Gabriel for the invitation to this session. This is a great opportunity to shed light on Indigenous heritage practices, especially from local perspectives, which are still quite underrepresented in the fields of digital archaeology and humanities, museology and heritage conservation. But fortunately, there has been growing momentum over the past decade. To introduce myself, my name is Paula Rauhala. I am a North Sami conservator working at an Indigenous-led and community-based Sami museum in northern Norway called Sami Huerkatavirat, which operates under RiddoDuottarMuseat Museum Consortium. My work includes collections management, digitization, and conservation. In my daily work with the collections, I handle everything from everyday utensils to culturally sensitive heritage, which I will be speaking about shortly as a case study later on. So to start first, let's begin with some definitions. We will clarify the key terminology for today's discussion, starting with the term indigenous, then cultural heritage and knowledge, and lastly, digital technologies. So to start with the term indigenous, there is not a single universal way to define indigenous peoples because the circumstances of indigeneity vary across regions and continents. For simplicity, we can describe indigenous peoples as organized groups, communities, tribes, clans, and nations with diverse ties to a region that predates colonization or the formation of settler states. They maintain distinct cultures, languages, and social, political, and intellectual systems. And even this definition may be somewhat restrictive, but it provides a starting point for our discussion. To give some context, I belong to the North Sami community here in northern Norway. The Sami are part of the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar Arctic. I also want to emphasize that the Sami, we are not one single group. The Sami people consist of many diverse communities across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula in Russia. Then we can go to cultural heritage and knowledge. The diversity of indigenous groups globally is reflected in richness and variety of their cultural heritage. To put it briefly, indigenous cultural heritage includes a diverse range of material culture across social, practical, spiritual, intellectual, and aesthetic domains, both traditional and contemporary expressions. It also includes sacred sites, territories, and landscapes. So it's a really rich fabric of both tangible and intangible heritage. Again, to give context from a Sami perspective, the richness of materials and resources here in the circumpolar Arctic has allowed the Sami to produce a wide variety of heritage objects. Sami communities have also maintained very long-standing trade relationships with various groups, which has further contributed to the diversity of their heritage. Sami material culture includes everyday utensils such as wooden trays, burl cups, clothing, bags like reindeer fur coats, reindeer leather bags, as well as esoteric or culturally sensitive heritage, such as ancestral Sami drums, which hold profound sacred value for both historical and contemporary Sami communities. And I will speak more about the drums shortly. When I speak of esoteric value, I mean sensitive or secret knowledge that's not public and is accessible only to select individuals or groups. And really, needless to say, that this richness of cultural heritage is not unique to the Sami. It's a reality to other indigenous peoples as well globally. Let's say the Haida and the Tlingit nations with their ceremonial crest hats, Mapuche communities with ceremonial drums, Inuit communities with carved masks, and the Tupinamba, Giolivensa people in Brazil with their sacred cloaks. The list goes on. In simple terms, indigenous cultural heritage spans multiple domains depending on its use, method of production or acquisition, and historical context. Then when we talk about knowledge in the context of Indigenous cultural heritage, it often embodies a relational nature, connecting tangible and intangible aspects of culture. Indigenous knowledge can be understood through different ontologies and epistemic frameworks, including approaches such as post-humanism. So, culturally embedded knowledge, for example, knowledge of animals, plants, and heritage, often goes beyond what Western science articulates. Also, culturally embedded knowledge is organized in ways that do not necessarily align with Western taxonomies. For example, in the North Sami context, ancestral Sami drums are not considered passive objects, and in fact, they are not considered objects at all, but they are understood as non-human beings with agency, and each drum has its own purpose to fulfill. And this understanding stems from Sami ontologies and epistemic frameworks. Then, regarding digital technologies in the context of cultural heritage, this encompasses a wide range of 2D and 3D practices, and please note that throughout the Sunoikisi Spring Heritage sessions, several sessions explore the technical application of many 3D methods in much greater detail, so please be sure to check them out for more details. Also, I want to highlight that I am not an expert in all of these techniques, so please feel free to correct me if I misspeak. So, 2D technologies include photography, visual illustrations, digital scans, and audiovisual recordings, while 3D technologies cover imaging and modeling methods such as photogrammetry, laser scanning, structured light scanning, computer tomography, and time-of-flight cameras, including LiDAR. Also, GIS and mapping are widely used, and of course, 3D printing. I also want to mention reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, very useful for studying an object's manufacture or production history by analyzing surface details. Over the last decade, the use of 3D technologies in Indigenous cultural heritage has definitely increased. In Sami context, this use has been steadily growing within museums and cultural institutions. For example, in our Sami museum, we use both photogrammetry and structured light scanners to document and study cultural heritage. To give a couple of examples, probably one of the most well-known projects using 3D technologies in Indigenous context is the Tlingit clan crest hat, digitized in collaboration with the Tlingit clan in Sitka, Alaska, and the Smithsonian Institution. Another good example is the Nunalleg Digital Museum, which represents Yupik heritage objects online. And of course, here at our museum, we digitize an ancestral Sami drum, which I will talk about in more detail shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Over to the other Paula.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabby. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Paula Granados and I'm the head of the Endangered Material Knowledge Program. And my connection is not great, so I may turn off my camera soon, but I'm gonna be speaking about the work of the program. So my background is in archaeology, and I'm an archaeologist by training, and then my PhD was on linked open data technologies and digital humanities and how to make data accessible in an easier way for archaeologists for sharing and processing and gathering information. And right now, as I said, I'm the head of this program, the Endangered Material Knowledge Program at the British Museum, and we are funded by Arcadia. We're externally funded, and but we are hosted by the museum. And what we do is that we support communities and scholars internationally to document what we call material knowledge systems. So what we mean by this idea of material knowledge systems is that we are not so focused on the tangible objects themselves, but rather in the whole system of knowledge in which the production happens, in which the making of the object happens. So all the layers of information that include, as Paula was saying, social, practical, spiritual, intellectual, and aesthetic domains, and how that knowledge can be recorded, and how the making process can be better contextualized within the museum collection, kind of like bridging the gap in between the tangible and the intangible. So so in my section, I'm going to be discussing indigenous, but also traditional knowledge. And the reason for this is that, as I'm saying, the program that I work for is an international program. And so it has a much broader scope. We don't work with a specific community necessarily, but with several communities in several regions across the world. And therefore, we don't focus only on indigenous peoples as such, but also communities more broadly, and traditional knowledge holders as well. At the same time, in some cases, communities can be seen as a sort of monolithic or solid group, as Paula was saying, but that's not the case. Rather, in one same community, there are different opinions and perspectives, and therefore that makes things more nuanced and complex. And what I'm sharing is here is my views on the challenges and issues that we encounter in the program when trying to support communities and researchers to document this knowledge that is not linear or simple or monolithic, but rather very nuanced, complex, and a mix of different ideas and concepts. So anyway, so having said that, in the context of the program, before starting any projects, we ask researchers and communities to ask key guiding questions around the course of the project. And these questions help in shaping the proposal and putting together ideas that are going to be then developed further in the different stages of the project itself. So I thought it was useful to start with this kind of like guiding questions slide to kind of like help us think whenever we start any project related to indigenous or traditional heritage or knowledge on like, and these are the main questions: who are we doing this for? Who is involved? To what extent is the community involved? Are they involved from the beginning? As Gabby said, are they involved in the decision making process from the beginning? What are the benefits of the project itself? What are the benefits of the project to the community? What are the benefits to research, to advancing research, to advancing knowledge? What is the impact? And in many cases, this impact is not necessarily something we can measure. So how, for example, if we are talking about environmental impact, is the impact something we can measure right now, or is something that we will be able to measure in 5-10 years after the project? How can we figure out the impact for our activities in the field? Who is the author or the creator? If we are doing a collaborative project, a collective project with a community, is something that is coming together from many different contributions, or is just one contribution? And how are we accounting for that kind of like collective thinking? And of course, this big question of how the project will be shared, how the outputs will be shared. And this is also related with what Paula was saying about open access and the issues of open access in relation to sacred or secret knowledge. How are we honoring that? How are we respecting that? And making clear from the very beginning how the content will be shared and how access will be provided and to what audiences. So moving on to the next slide. So this is kind of related to what, like, we always show this slide. Is kind of, it's been shown many times in this, probably you've seen it before in this same term, but it's this idea that, as Paula was saying as well, technologies are spreading quite quickly and they're advancing research in many, many ways. And they are developing in amazing ways. However, the fact that technology is there doesn't mean necessarily that we have to use it always. So, for example, the fact that we can do 3D models of objects or that we can do virtual reality environments doesn't mean that we need to do it, or that we have the ethical grounds to do it properly, or that the community is happy to do it. So it's always considering the ethics of our practice and making sure that the aims of the project are guided by these ideas. So this is the quote of like Jurassic Park, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could do that they didn't stop to think if they should do it, right? So always thinking, should I do this? What's the impact and what are the benefits? One of the key questions that we're going to discuss today is this idea of the fair and the care principle. So there is a definition of this in the readings, and there is also some information on the description of the session today, but we want to kind of like give some clear kind of like concepts before going into further detail of the issues and challenges of implementing these principles. So as you may already know, the FAIR principles were developed in 2016 to provide guidelines on making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. They stem from the open access movement with the idea that all data should have minimal access restrictions, and its particular emphasis is on increasing the capacity of computer systems to find and reuse data, as humans rely more and more on devices to help us navigate through the increasing volume and complexity of information. So these principles were developed in a way for computers to access data easily, for data to be accessible and interoperable across repositories and data sources, and also I would say with kind of a more scientific data idea in mind. So more focusing on scientific data and how to share data that perhaps is not as sensitive as data that comes from living communities, as we know now. So another issue of the FAIR principles is that they don't engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. And they follow this premise that all data should be open, which, as we have discussed, in some cases may not be the best decision for a specific Indigenous group that want to protect their knowledge for very specific and varied reasons. As Paula has said, there are groups who have different perspectives on access and preservation, and that is defined by the nature of the sensitivity of the material preserved and the rights of the knowledge holders. So this the data-centric perspective of the FAIR principles, and to add an ethical responsibility dimension to the processing of the information. So this idea, is the idea of like, how can we apply the FAIR principles while also applying the CARE principles? And I'm not saying that this is possible or that this is already happening. I'm just saying that many projects across the board are looking at how to make them interoperable, how to integrate both in the kind of data processing workflows, and if this is at all possible. And I don't have the answer for this, and it would be very interesting to have this discussion in the sessions in class to see whether there is a possibility for these both to operate together. So we're going to be looking at that. So as I'm saying, to address the power imbalance between communities, data collectors, and data service providers, and the data and storage should be designed to enable Indigenous communities to benefit from the data, recognize Indigenous authorship of the data, their rights and interests in it, and data should be actively stewarded by and with community members. Facilitate a responsible use and expand capacity in digital literacy and infrastructure within Indigenous communities through reciprocal relationships, generating data in the languages and worldviews of those communities. Minimize harm, respect the rights, and fairly represent those communities, and take into account possible future uses of the data. As I was saying before, by possible uses, we mean how data is going to be shared, how is it going to be accessible, and how people are going to be able to interact with it or work with it in the future. So However, there is this problem here, right? Because we are talking about principles that support the fair sharing of information, sharing information freely and openly, and then we have other set of principles that stand for a more perhaps cautious or careful sharing of the data to make sure that the communities and people that this data comes from are involved in the decision-making process. And this is how we get to this kind of challenge of how to make this work, how to operationalize the fair and fair principles for Indigenous data. And I wanted to bring here this paper from Carl, Herzog, and Hudson, that discusses this idea of like how to make it possible, how to make them operational from the very beginning of the data cycle. So they have examples of data collection, for example, defining cultural metadata, recording provenance in metadata. Also in the data stewardship stage, use appropriate governance models, make data fair, implement care in data community or engaging with communities by looking at Indigenous ethics, informing access, using tools for transparency, integrity, and provenance. And finally, in the data applications themselves, looking at fairness, accountability, transparency, and assessing equity. And I will also say benefit to the communities themselves. So when we try to work with the principles, one of the approaches that best work for us is this idea of the questions. So rather than giving principles to people and saying, oh, this is the guideline, these are the principles you need to follow, sometimes we have seen that questions work better because they help you figure out the direction of your project. They help you put together, as I'm saying, the kind of like the idea behind it, the scaffolding of the project itself. So basically questions help you think, right? So instead of perhaps following the principles as such, sometimes it's more helpful to make you questions on how to apply them. So when we are talking about collective benefit, which is the first principle, the C, perhaps thinking at like whose heritage we are working with, we are looking at like who is the decision maker in this, who is the knowledge holder that I need to consult, that I need to work with, who is making the decisions, who will benefit from this, who will take long ownership on the materials, and how will you enable multiple voices to be reflected in the creation and presentation of materials like 3D models or any other sort of documentation that you are generating. So basically, it's just making questions yourself to see how you would answer them and how they will be answered and represented in the project itself. The second principle is authority to control. So some questions that can help and guide this is like whose consent is required, who is taking the lead, who are you planning to involve and consult with? How will you ensure long-term control once the materials have been published and released? And if you are considering publishing results in open access, how are you communicating the implications of open access to your participants? This is something very important for us as well, because we require something called informed consent before any person or any participant is taking part in EMKP funded projects. And informed consent doesn't just mean signing a form to say that you are giving consent, but rather making sure that the person that is giving consent has all the information on how the project is going to work, the data that is going to be collected, and again, how that data is going to be published, if any results are going to be published or released online. And finally, the two last principles are responsibility and ethics, which kind of like relate to everything else, to all the other points. So this is kind of a more like bigger understanding of how you're going to ensure the development of positive relationships with the knowledge holders, grounded in respect, reciprocity, and mutual understanding. So how are you going to kind of like making sure that you are respecting, that you are bringing them in the process, and that all of that kind of like key aspects of the project are going to be defined by the communities themselves. So the second part of my presentation is going to focus on just a very, I've been discussing this from the beginning, but just a super brief overview of the program, of the Endangered Material Knowledge Program that I've been talking about. So as I said, we focus on the understanding of the resources, skills, technologies, and social values necessary to create and maintain the material world around us. It's not just the focus on the tangible or objects, but rather on the material knowledge systems that surround the making process. I'm a bit delayed, no, Gabby? I'm running out of time, or I'm fine?
We were slightly behind schedule for where we said we would be, but...
Okay, so very quickly, just an example of the kind of processes that we record, and some of the challenges that we have encountered that I have already mentioned. But basically, the whole focus of the program is to be capturing living knowledge. Therefore, it's a program that focuses on movement, gesture, embodied knowledge, and not like linear knowledge or information. And we believe that technology offers the possibility to record this knowledge and kind of like in a more contextualized way. And some of the big challenges in terms of like respecting this idea, for example, one of the issues, main issues, is that this information that we are recording is grounded in the community cosmovision, and that the language, the local language is used for the recording of these materials, of this documentation. So how these, for example, this is an example of the metadata schema of the program, in which we try to record specific terms and vocabularies, other forms of cultural knowledge. As Paula was saying, sometimes we are focusing on cultural heritage, but the community is more interested perhaps on knowledge about plants, or other forms of heritage that we haven't identified at the beginning. So botanical knowledge, relationships with the environment and with the different communities, relationships between them, connections between places and objects or information. So how this information is going to be recorded and made available together with the cultural items themselves. So there are different ways it can be recorded within the metadata. Some other projects prefer to make glossaries or list of words. So for example, this is related to a project that is recording weaving with pandanus plants and the pandanus leaves. And so in this project, they have created this glossary of the different types of pandanus and how they are referred in the community. Other very challenging aspects of, as well is sometimes when we're working with communities and as I said, we collect consent at the beginning, and the community is kind of at the beginning is on board of the process and happy to be sharing the data. But then as the project progresses, sometimes the perspective changes of how that knowledge is going to be shared. And so it's very important to kind of like navigate that change and work together to see what is going to be the final decision, just to acknowledge that things can change, that projects are dynamic and they can kind of like evolve in different ways, to try to understand how the next form of sharing, I would say, is kind of is the best for that specific context. And finally, also wanted to talk about, as I said, one of the other challenges is the ecological impact. So it's not just the impact of the data or the information that you are recording, but also the environmental impact of your activities. So how you can measure the impact of your activities, how you can consider alternative ways in which the ecological impact can be reduced, and how can you assess the potential direct and indirect consequences in the long term. So not just after the project, but rather in the long term. So I think that's everything from me. I'm sorry for
That's great. Thank you, Paula. Apologies, I meant to take Paula's slides down. I accidentally took Paula's video down instead, but that's always do that. Great, thank you very much. I think Nicole is up next.
Hi, everyone. Everything okay? Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Yu. I am currently a lecturer at the University of Ottawa, and I am a former PhD student of Gabby's at the Institute of Classical Studies. And like many of you watching, I did a lot of my studies, a lot of my research within a classical or antiquities context, both in history and archaeology. My first archaeological experiences were in Europe in antiquities context. I think the first one I did was a Roman fortress from around the circa 1st century BC to AD in southern Croatia. But today I will be speaking to you a little bit more about my more recent experiences working as an archaeologist in Canada with Indigenous archaeology. And as I start, I just want to make it clear, I myself am not Indigenous. I am descended of immigrants who were fortunate enough to come to Canada and benefit from its opportunities. But just to be clear, I'm not here to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples of Canada. I just kind of want to discuss a little bit about my experiences working in these contexts, some considerations I had not encountered before working in Canada as an archaeologist, and hopefully, get the discussion started. So how exactly did I get to working with Indigenous archaeology in Canada? I was hired as an archaeologist for Parks Canada, what is Parks Canada? It is the federal government agency of the Government of Canada who is responsible for protecting and presenting nationally significant examples of Canada's natural and cultural heritage, including the management and administration of the national parks and national historic sites. So just really briefly, I just wanted to discuss some of the framework within which I was working within the Government of Canada and Parks Canada, not to necessarily promote either one, but just to explain a little bit. So you'll come across something called reconciliation or the reconciliation mandate, which is a mandate by the Government of Canada across all departments and agencies. And it's basically the commitment of achieving reconciliation with Indigenous peoples through renewed nation-to-nation, government-to-government, and Inuit-Crown relationship based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership as the foundation for transformative change. Within Parks Canada specifically, there was a new policy put into place in 2024, I believe, called the Indigenous Stewardship Policy, which is basically an acknowledgement on Parks Canada's part that their previous actions have severed, altered Indigenous people's long-standing relationship and sacred responsibilities for the lands, water, and ice within modern-day Canada, and that these relationships and responsibilities have determined Indigenous people's identities and influenced their cultures and languages for thousands of years. I just want to be clear, in no way, just because there are these official mandates and policies, that means that everything has been sorted out. I would say really it's more of an acknowledgement and an understanding that there has to be an open, ongoing dialogue, which is ever evolving between the government, between Parks Canada as an agency, and various Indigenous groups with which it is working. It's the understanding that we need to figure out ways to work together, not only to move forward politically as a modern pluralist nation, and also environmentally, but it certainly has a lot of impact on how we consider, when we consider cultural heritage, its conservation, its treatment, and how it is studied. To kind of further prove that point, I just wanted to very quickly discuss how there is so much diversity when we talk about Indigenous groups in Canada. This is a very detailed map, which I have like shrunk down just for this slide. This is, I think, from the Canadian Geographic, and you can access this map online. And if you do, you are able to zoom in to various parts of the map, which shows you a lot of the regions that were traditionally inhabited by the many different Indigenous groups, as well as it mentions a lot of both historic and modern day treaties. These are basically more official agreements between Indigenous groups and different levels of government, be that provincial, territorial, and federal, as well as with the Crown, as we are still under the British Crown here in Canada. But this is just to say that just because there are a lot of these treaties and agreements in place, there's obviously a lot of history of these groups being forcibly pushed off their traditional lands. The Canadian Constitution also recognizes 3 groups or categories of Indigenous peoples. We have the First Nations, and there are over 630 First Nations who represent more than 50 historical and cultural nations and 50 different Indigenous languages. We have the Inuit, who are the Indigenous people of the Arctic, and we also have a category called the Métis. And the Métis history is very important when we discuss the history of Canada generally. They are essentially people who are descendants of early unions between Europeans and Indigenous people with regard to the creation and the development of the fur trade in the 17th century. And these early unions and mixed families basically created their own sense of community, cultural customs, and unique identity. Now, I don't mean to kind of gloss this over because this definitely it deserves quite a bit of time and energy. I wish more people were aware. Some of you may have also heard about part of Canada's really unfortunate, terrible history when it comes to residential schools. In a kind of simplified, abridged version, these residential schools were institutions, almost like re-education institutions that were in practice for over 150 years. I believe the last one closed only in like the mid-90s, so quite recently, all things considered. And basically, it was a period in which many Indigenous children were essentially taken from their families and communities with the goal of basically, and unfortunately, this is a direct quote, of killing the Indigenous child, basically forcibly removing them from their own communities, practices, languages, with the idea of reshaping their identities to be part of this post-colonial nation. If you ever have a chance to look up some of the statistics regarding residential schools, they are truly, truly horrific when it comes to the rates of abuse, the rates of mortality as well, not just when it comes to the treatment of the children there, but also the conditions in which they were living. This is to say that because the last Indigenous school, as I mentioned, only closed in the mid-90s, we are still, as a nation, dealing with the fallout of this. There are people who are still survivors from this horrific system. There are families who are very much affected by this. And when you are working with Indigenous groups, it's important to be aware that definitely certain traumas can come up, and it is extremely impactful when you consider the idea that a lot of these people have been really been forcibly disconnected from their own heritage and their own culture. So moving along, I thought I would discuss a very brief case study in terms of one of the projects I was fortunate enough to participate on. It was one called Beausoleil Island. Just to move back, sorry, really quickly. I don't know if you can see at the bottom of my screen in this map, you see the 5 Great Lakes, basically what I like to call the right side of the palm tree, that's Lake Huron. And you'll see up top, the top there is Georgian Bay, which is connected to it. And it's within Georgian Bay that there are quite a few islands, including the Georgian Bay Islands National Park. And we were excavating on one particular island called Beausoleil Island. Beausoleil Island is a really, really interesting context historically. It is the traditional inhabited territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe are a group of culturally related Indigenous peoples comprising of various different nations and who speak from the same language group. But clearly with the name Beausoleil Island, it was named for actually a Métis settler, that the Métis were present as well. And being in within the Great Lakes, as well as Georgian Bay and a bunch of other waterways, it kind of was a bit of a crossroads for many different groups who came through for interaction and for trade. And that is very much shown through the typology of the pottery that has been recovered through not just our excavation, but other ones done on the island. That, the typology or the types of pottery really demonstrate that there is a blending of cultures and different groups who passed through, which is really, really spectacular. So one other thing to keep in mind is that in the 19th century, there were 2, and this is, of course, after arrival of the Europeans and colonization, there were 2 reserves, which each had their own religious affiliation from, I think one was a Catholic one, the other one was a Protestant one, that were established on the island. But eventually these two reserves failed, and the inhabitants from these islands actually moved off to different surrounding islands. So when I was there at this excavation, we had several Indigenous liaisons and an elder who came from these other communities, from these neighboring islands, which basically means that it was their ancestors who were inhabitants of Beausoleil Island, and it was their heritage which we were fortunate enough to come by and to show them what we had found. So one particularly amazing discovery we found while we were there was a really massive, beautiful ceramic vessel, which had a lot of detail in its decoration. However, the way that it was found was it was near a hearth, and it looks like it had almost been smashed purposefully and like upside down. So there's a strong suggestion that maybe it had been smashed on purpose and deliberately for a ceremonial purpose, and which is not uncommon for some of the practices in that region. And one thing that came about was discussing how best to study and to conserve this massive vessel, because basically the idea of just us reconstructing it at the lab physically would be considered quite disrespectful, because if it was meant to be smashed on purpose for a ceremonial spiritual purpose, we should really not just be putting it together just for our sake of trying to understand. So in this situation, it was agreed that 3D modeling would be considered a really great alternative to that, so that we wouldn't be physically putting the vessel back together and it could be eventually repatriated, but we could use 3D modeling to try and understand, to virtually reconstruct the vessel, to have a better idea, to get a better sense for the typology as well. So with all that being said, a lot of digital humanities techniques and a lot of modern technologies are really great alternatives and great suggestions in terms of how to work in various contexts. However, one thing I also found when working with Indigenous peoples and in Indigenous contexts is that technology doesn't replace the live human experience. You'll hear a lot about, at least in Canada, the discussion of what we call protocols when working with Indigenous peoples or on traditional Indigenous lands. And they're essentially different practices which respect the traditional Indigenous knowing, being, doing sort of approach. And basically, as I said, just demonstrates respect and awareness. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, and I certainly know that there are a lot of variations amongst them. So just want to be clear, but just a few that I got to be a part of while I was there were basically things like tobacco offerings. Tobacco is one of the 4 traditional sacred medicines for many Indigenous communities. And the idea is that not just within archaeology, but also other projects, it can be construction or development, that when you are starting a project, you will have the elder of one of the communities who traditionally inhabited that area present, and that you offer them some tobacco, usually in the form of a bundle, which you offer to them with your left hand closer to your heart, and as a way to very respectfully introduce yourself about who you are, where you come from, and what is your purpose for being there. There are also groundbreaking and closing ceremonies, and this is one that we did at our excavation as well. Groundbreaking, kind of self-descriptive in terms of breaking the ground for our excavation, but it can also, again, be for construction as well. And then there's a bit of a closing ceremony kind of at the end of a project. Ours, at least our project, was combined a bit with a water ceremony as well as kind of like a talking circle. Water ceremonies, again, for a lot of projects that take place close to water or bodies of water, such as ours being in Georgian Bay. It's the notion of acknowledging that water is not just a resource, but also a living spirit and a living thing. And finally, with the talking circle, I found this really, really powerful because it basically was a way that everybody who was involved in the project, to some extent, we were standing in a circle, but basically everybody is given an opportunity to speak on their experiences during the project and what they are grateful for. And this was really amazing because it facilitates dialogue, active listening, and shared understanding, as well as a form of equality amongst everybody involved in the project. And what came about in this particular project, as I mentioned before, with having our Indigenous liaisons and the elder present, as well as some of my colleagues as well come from Indigenous backgrounds, is that it actually became really emotional because it was this notion of being able to reconnect with their heritage, which unfortunately, as I said, has been kind of torn away from them. And yeah, it was such a touching experience, and one that I had never experienced before when working in archaeology. And just to sum up, we also have smudging, which again is the burning of sacred medicines such as tobacco, sage, cedar, sweetgrass are the traditional ones for spiritual cleansing. And this was also done in our closing ceremony. So just to finish off, just some final thoughts from my experiences as an archaeologist working in and still with kind of classical context and then in Indigenous ones, really specific to antiquity. Using the term Romanization, I guess, in archaeology and material culture, with the notion of Romanization or one really dominant culture basically, expanding, dominating over another one, and essentially kind of erasing it and just imposing its own system and infrastructure in place. We know when it comes to the ancient context that that's not always like very clear cut, nor is that really accurate. But it's also made me rethink as well, because unfortunately Romanization, and when we discuss the expansion of the Roman Empire, is unfortunately tied a lot with more modern colonization and ideas today. That basically, that it wasn't true then, and it's still not true as a concept now. There is a lot of blending of cultures, and a lot are taken from different cultures when they actually meet. Again, not oversimplifying or overgeneralizing Indigenous groups in Canada in today's world, nor in the ancient world. And there's no one size fits all approach to working with Indigenous groups, because there's so much diversity, not just in terms of groups, but also individuals and their experiences. Always try to diversify perspectives and accounts, avoid misinterpretation just based solely on Western models. And finally, Indigenous archaeology, but also a lot of archaeology generally, is not just an object to study, not just something for us to discover, but it's often connected and very meaningful to many people even today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole. Great. I think next we have another case study. Paula Rauhala is going to talk about the Sami ancestral drum and the digitization project around that.
Thank you, Gabriel. Just a second, I have to adjust one of my slides.
Sure.
Yeah, there we go. So thank you both Paula and Nicole for great presentations. I have few questions for both Paula and Nicole, but I think we can do that as the last part. Yeah. So I will briefly speak about a digitization project of an ancestral Sami drum conducted by our Sami Museum in collaboration with the local North Sami community. Before that, I will first provide some background on ancestral Sami drums. So part of the history of these sacred drums is quite tragic. During the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, most Sami drums were expropriated from their communities, often through force, missionary efforts, or state policies. And these emerging nation-states rejected Sami religion and spirituality, viewing the drums as instruments of ungodly sorcery. As mentioned earlier, ancestral Sami drums are treated by North Sami communities not as objects, but as non-human beings. This is because the drums embody a worldview that contrasts with Cartesian dualism and its binary divisions. The drums, they hold profound value for both historical and contemporary Sami communities because the drums, they served as important companions for community healers and ritual specialists. With and through the drums, healers work to support the well-being of the whole community. The healer was responsible for the drum, and access to it was regulated, meaning that the drums were not available to anyone at any time. But it's also important to note that some families could have their own drums, even if they were not healers. Many of the expropriated Sami drums eventually ended up in collections around Europe, including the UK, as shown on the map to the right. Sami drums can be found in museums, for example in Germany, Sweden, Denmark, France, and Italy. And today, 72 ancestral Sami drums have been identified worldwide, held in both museums and private collections. Then I will speak on our museum's digitization project of an ancestral Sami drum. This drum in North Sami is called kuovtis, and kuovtis is a specific term for a bowl-shaped drum crafted from a large and naturally grown hollowed-out pine barrel. Just to give a short background, this person, Paul Ante, named on this title, he was a historical figure. He was a Sami reindeer herder and a very skillful healer. He was born around the year 1600, and his companion, his drum, was presumably made before the 1650s. In 1691, Paul Ante was arrested on suspicion of witchcraft. Long story short, his kuovtis, meaning the drum, was confiscated, and in 1692 he was sentenced to death by the district court in northern Norway. While awaiting his final punishment in custody, Paul Ante was murdered by a fellow prisoner, and after his death, the kuovtis, meaning the drum, was sent to Copenhagen in Denmark, where it then became part of the Royal Danish Cabinet of Curiosities. Then, during the 1800s, when the National Museum of Denmark was established, this drum became part of their collections, and in 2022, this drum was repatriated to our Sami Museum, which is a very big milestone for local Sami communities and Sami museum institutions, but also globally because it represents a growing recognition for Indigenous cultural rights. And I just want to highlight, even though the drum was repatriated to our museum and our museum's name is on the documents, repatriation documents, the museum wants to highlight that it's repatriated to the local North Sami community, and it's available to the community through our museum. And before the drum's repatriation, this drum has been on a loan agreement in our museum since the late 1970s. And in 2020, the digitization project of the drum began. The drum was digitized at our museum using structured light 3D scanners. And during this time, the head of our department held consultations with the local North Sami community to understand the wishes regarding the drum. And it relates something to what Nicole said earlier, that not like any other group, also Sami communities can hold very differing opinions about digitization, repatriation, and overall about the heritage. So there was a lot of negotiations going on regarding the drum, digitization, repatriation, but at the end, unity existed on general level. So anyway, this is a very unique setting because Sami museums and cultural institutions rarely get the opportunity to digitize ancestral drums, keeping in mind that there are only 72 ancestral drums discovered globally. And today, most of these Sami drums are held by individuals or institutions outside Sami communities. And only a few Sami museum institutions, let alone the communities themselves, have access to or ownership of these ancestral drums. When our 3D team began scanning the drum, the team first had to establish institutional guidelines for the digitization. And This process involved deciding how the drum should be first approached, and then how it should be documented, managed, and finally shared. And this approach reflects the care principles that Paula presented earlier. The guidelines established in our museum are informed by historical practices surrounding the ancestral drums, making sure that the digitization process respects drums' cultural integrity. Again, because they are considered non-human beings, they have cultural integrity that needs to be safeguarded. Also, during and after the digitization process, the files are stored and organized according to hierarchies, according to their cultural status and local Sami names. Since the digitization of Paula and the drum, our 3D team has been digitizing other ancestral Sami drums in European museums, which means more data has now been stored in appropriate Sami terminology. And earlier I introduced the North Sami term for a bowl drum as quotis, but there are South Sami words, there are Julev Sami words, there are Skol Sami words for drums. So the Sami terminology around ancestral drums is very diverse and very rich. Then next, I would like to address the issue of publishing sensitive digital heritage, especially regarding the publication and access to these digitized drums. To give some background context, photographs of Sami drums have been published on various platforms, such as RiddoDuottarMuseat, which is a major online exhibition and heritage hub used in Norway and Sweden. Also, some Sami museums in Norway publish photos of drums on their own websites. And while these photographs are typically protected by copyright laws and IPR, the cultural commodification of indigenous Sami heritage is growing. So for this reason, our Sami museum has not made the 3D models of the drums openly accessible, but they are accessible to community members upon request. For example, if you go to our museum sketch fab account, you won't find any 3D models accessible. We are still working on that. But we have to first make sure that the 3D models of the drums are safeguarded. And despite all the copyright and IPR protections, esoteric elements of Sami cultural heritage, such as drum symbols, are very much appropriated by transnational manufacturers and also local businesses. For example, if you travel to Norway, Sweden, Finland, and you go to these souvenir shops, you can immediately see that all the products are saturated with esoteric Sami heritage elements, such as the drum symbols. So, despite the efforts to protect and safeguard Sami drums, new opportunities for misuse emerge, especially with new technological developments, such as 3D printing. So, it's a tricky space to navigate because, on the other hand, now that the drum has been repatriated to us, we want to do research on it using novel technologies and preserve it digitally and make it accessible. But also, we have to think how to carry out this work in a way that safeguards the drum and prevents misuse and cultural commodification. Then to conclude, it's fair to say that although digitization has become increasingly common over the past decade, with First Nations projects often leading the way, the use of 3D technologies in Sami heritage context remains quite new practice still. So for that reason, it requires careful consideration before digitizing culturally sensitive heritage. The modern digital era brings esoteric Sami heritage into new digital, social, and political domains, and therefore calls for renewed attention. What I mean by political domains is that we had some cases many years ago where a company tried to patent some Sami drum symbols, so only they could use them, but luckily it didn't go through, but these things happen. Also, given the drum's high spiritual and cultural value, as well as the history of violent expropriation associated with them, ancestral Sami drums are not the easiest material to approach. And also, like Paula said earlier in her presentation, that just because we have the technology and we want to do something with it, doesn't mean we should, but at the end, I feel like it's in the hands of the community and relevant institution whether the digitization of esoteric heritage should be done. So the digitization of the Sami drum now, the digitization process has been done because the community agreed and also our museum. Then I would also like to highlight that digitization of culturally sensitive Indigenous heritage is context-specific, and therefore consultation with the relevant source communities or other appropriate stakeholders is recommended before taking action. And while the direct participation of source communities in decision-making processes might not always be fully possible, I personally view each consultation as a step toward a more ethical and holistic approach to digitization. And it's also important to remember that community consultations often include elders. So using culturally appropriate terminology can go a long way in building trust and respect. And as a final thought, digitization of culturally sensitive Indigenous heritage can be a holistic process and not just a technical application. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And I think we're going to end with a brief discussion of issues around grants and fundraising around Indigenous heritage, I think, Paula.
Yes, yeah, so we just wanted to give a little overview of granting bodies to work with Indigenous heritage. There's some considerations that are worth keeping in mind before starting work, because sometimes we believe, oh, I'll get the funding and then I'll start the project, and it actually it doesn't work that way. It's very important to have these considerations in mind before deciding which granting body you're applying to, because sometimes they do have very specific requirements. So I wanted to start with just two resources for granting, to find granting bodies that can be useful for your research. So one of them is this website for grant makers for cultural heritage preservation, which is a network, an informal network of funding organizations with a global remit that support projects internationally. So it's a really good place to start because it can give you an overview of like granting bodies that could be relevant to you. So I recommend looking here, and I also recommend this other resource, which is the Heritage Funding Directory. And this directory has about 400 different funding bodies that you can look into, see what kind of work they fund, what are the requirements, how the application process works. But what I really like of this resource is that they also provide guidance and case studies. So they give guidance on how to put together an application of the sort of key areas that you have to go deeper in for each specific funding body, and I think that is quite interesting in this case. And so just to give you some overview of like the different funding bodies and then the different granting processes that you can apply to, it really varies depending on your needs and your specific area of work. So there are more like specific UK-based granting bodies, international or philanthropic foundations. And these are just some of the examples, and these are also referenced in the resources that I mentioned. But since we don't have a lot of time, perhaps the most interesting slide for people to keep in mind is this one, which is the challenges and the key areas that you need to think about before applying for funding. So for the first one and foremost is choose wisely. Look very wisely and very carefully at the requirements of the funding body, if they are asking you to publish everything open access or not, how, like, what are the processes, what type of categories they allow for you to include in the budget, if you're going to include allowances for your knowledge holders, do they allow you to do that, do they not? Sometimes there are, as you can see here, there are systemic and procedural barriers. The application can be quite complex. If you are working together with community members, can they have access to the application? Is in a language? Are you applying in a language that they understand? There is also the issue of cultural misalignment. So what are the metrics of the project? How are you going to measure impact or outputs? Is that even something you want to consider? Also looking, as I was saying, at rigid funding structures in terms of the budget, but also the time of the project. What is the reporting structure? Can you meet it? Can the community meet it? And is it worth applying for that? And also, as I'm saying, other specific requirements in terms of like sharing the outputs and accessibility and publication. So yeah, we just wanted to finish with this, I guess, to kind of like give people an overview of key issues and concerns to keep in mind before applying for funding when working with Indigenous and traditional heritage and knowledge.
Great, thank you very much, Paula. That's super useful, actually. Yeah. Great. So yes, thanks to everyone for the insights and examples. This has been really quite exciting. This is a moment where if anybody watching live would like to ask any questions, the live chat is open. We'll keep an eye on that, and we'll look for anything that we have there. We could also maybe start by asking questions among ourselves while we're waiting for people to come up with anything. I know Paula Rauhala said that you had questions for both of the others already. We could start there. Or, who would like to start?
Yeah, first I would have a question for Nicole about the original, it was pottery, ceramic pottery that was found. May I ask what happened to the original pottery that was found?
So the original one, as far as I know, has been taken to the lab and basically, I can't say cleaned because in terms of even just the state in which it was in and the materials, it can't be really cleaned, maybe just brushed up a little bit. But it is currently in the collection. In terms of how to move forward with it, because my understanding is that it was also quite delicate as well. I'm not yet sure. I think they're trying to figure out solutions. But yeah, the main thing is that it will not be physically put back together.
Thank you. And then just another comment to Nicole. Interesting, you mentioned that the community members, they have a way of communicating with the heritage pieces, and interesting that we have lots of like similarities with the ceremonies and the contemporary ceremonial protocols to communicate with the heritage. So that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to say as well, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Indigenous liaisons who were there, and I'm sure it depends and it varies quite a bit. One sense or somebody described it a little bit, and part of why it was such an emotional kind of experience was it's the kind of idea that maybe their ancestors in a way had actually made it so that we would find their artifacts and some of their heritage so that their descendants could actually see it in a way. So again, that was how some liaisons felt about the experience, which was really, really beautiful in a way.
Sorry, just one more comment came to my mind regarding, because it was found on the ground or on the landscape, and we had a similar case with an ancestral drum that was actually found between a rock in South Sami areas. And then they had discussions like whether it should be taken out from the rock, or should the community and the liaison people just to leave it there. But then eventually they ended up taking the heritage and then move forward with it.
Wow. No, it's for sure. It's interesting. And as I said, it's something that I hadn't really considered too much about before, even though I think when I was speaking to Gabby a little bit about this, actually it does come up in more context than we realize, the idea of, you know, when you find something which is a heritage of another group, should you really be the one to remove it? Should you be able, should you be the one to manipulate it? Should you even be the one to store it or preserve it even after the fact? That is definitely a discussion that comes in even with the antiquities in terms of in whose museums and in which countries should things be displayed and so forth. So it is really it is an interesting conversation, and one that comes up quite often as well in a different contexts.
Thanks, Nicole. And can I just continue? Sorry. I have one more question to Paula regarding the grants. You mentioned that there might be like open access requirements, let's say after a digitization process. Is there like any leeway to negotiate this, or is it written in stone that that's a must?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a question we get a lot because obviously those issues come up a lot in the fieldwork. So it's like the general requirement of at least the program, the EMKP, is for everything to be open access, because the idea is that the materials that are generated with the grant will be shared widely. There is a requirement to deposit the materials in country. So that is a requirement, that the materials stay in country with the community, but also that they are published open access for researchers and community members to be able to access in the future. However, there is a way, there is a leeway. There are some negotiations that can happen. Mostly the program is interested in the material aspect, in the material process and the making, the knowledge around the making. But we understand that there are many more knowledges that are going to happen in that process, like ritual, sacred knowledge, and so on. So we can see whether those aspects, those elements can be left out. They can be recorded, but then left out of the dataset so that they are not published open access. Or there is also the possibility that they are published in the repository, but they are not open access. They are embargoed, and therefore they have to be accessed only by a request, so that someone puts on a request and that comes to the team that mediates access. The problem with that is that it's not so easy for us to mediate that access, because it's not so easy for us to identify who is sending the request, which community they are coming from, because since we are a global program that work internationally in many different locations, it's hard for us to be able to identify the context of or the background of the person that is emailing us. So that can lead to some issues in terms of resources, capacity, and so on. But it's definitely something that we are trying to accommodate and navigate to. The idea for us is to support the community and the knowledge holders and the researchers in documenting this and making it available to the extent that they feel comfortable with. So it's always trying to find that ground in which they are happy to share, and not going beyond that if they don't want to share the rest.
Yeah, thank you, Paula.
I think we have a question in the chat for Paula R. I'm going to show the question and read it out loud just in case. So thank you so much for the presentation. This is Sarah Williams, who I assume is a student of Gabby's. Looking at the British Museum record for the Sami drum, are you able to hope that it can come home?
Thanks for the question. It's a good question. That would depend from what community the drum originates from, because there are many Sami communities with different, like diverse, rich heritage. So depending on where the drum originates from, which community, then it would be upon that community and relevant Sami institution to together decide whether they would request repatriation or not. So yeah, I would have to check first which community it originates from, because as a North Sami community member, we can't really speak behalf of other Sami communities. Maybe they want it to be repatriated, maybe they don't, and it's really up to the communities.
I just have a comment in terms, like in general, because I found that the three kind of presentations work together very, very well, in the sense that from Paula I could get a much more like a specific idea of how things are working in their museum, which is really great for us, because it's like seeing the practicalities of these care principles, as I was saying, and the difficulties of applying them, but in a very specific case. And that was super useful. And then Nicole bringing in the sort of like archaeological background, but working with living communities, and how that archaeology and that background is still relevant today and is still informing the decisions that we are making today, right? It's really powerful. So for me, it was really great to be able to see kind of like studies of the sort of like overarching principles that we are trying to apply here, and how sometimes principles are very helpful and can guide practice, but then in the day-to-day and in the practical issues is where you really kind of like need to make it happen, and you really learn through consultation and community work to make it possible.
And as we're starting to come to the end of time, can I, not the end of time, but the end of our time, can I just ask very quickly a question about the exercise that we've proposed for this? Let me see if I can put that on the screen very quickly. I do have it somewhere.
It's on my slides if you want to share. Yes.
I think I also have it. Okay, are you seeing the exercise?
No.
On the screen? No, wait. I've got to put it on stage first. So first I have to remove Paula's slides from the stage and put my slides on the stage. Okay, there we are. So this I think will be a really interesting exercise to have a look at 2 or 3 examples of projects working with Indigenous heritage using some kind of digital technologies, and think about them in the light of the fair and care principles, and then think of the different ways in which they either attempt or succeed in addressing these concerns. And I think this would be a really cool exercise for discussion for those people who are watching this because they're taking a class on this. Come along with your examples next week and have a think about them and discuss them with the rest of the group. But my first thought when I look at this, and I'm thinking about trying to find examples of this, is could you give us any pointers where to find such projects? Because I'm not quite sure what search terms I would use, etc. Looking for things. Do any of you have any suggestions of places where we might go, where we might find X number of examples that we could start to do, and if so, can we add them to this page?
Well, for one, the Endangered Material Knowledge Program could be one of them. There we are in the completed projects page. There is a very big list of projects that have documented material culture, material knowledge, and are making those results available online. Then the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage, there are some projects that are linked to it on like carrying it out work funded by UNESCO. So if you look at the funding bodies that I that I mentioned in my slide, you can see projects that are available through those funding bodies. There is also the Mukurtu Cultural Management System for Indigenous Heritage, which is a resource for Indigenous communities to make their content available online, the Mukurtu resource, and they do have case studies with communities that they've worked with to make their cultural heritage available. So it can also be a very good place to look for case studies of Indigenous heritage and content management systems that are available. Yeah, I think that would be a good place to start, because there is a lot of information there that can be relevant. Also, trying to find information online and doing some research can be a very good way of assessing if the resources, if to see to what extent they are available, they can be found, they are accessible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Could we stay on for 5 minutes after the end of this session and write that down, just because
yes.
I don't necessarily remember all of the things you just said.
Yes.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if Paula, your project or what you're working on has any representation online for people to access, not the materials and the drums themselves, but information about the project or something that could be accessible.
Well, I could recommend the Arctic University of Norway, which is located in Tromsø, northern Norway. So the Arctic University's Norway database, which is munin.no. So they have a master's thesis, PhD, dissertations, and if you just type in like heritage case study, it will suggest case studies for you.
Yeah. Also, in one of the papers recommended for the session, the one that we author on digitizing intangible material knowledge, we do mention a few cases of projects that are working on that. So there are a few references there that people can consult, and they can find related projects through those references from the recommended reading.
Cool, thank you. Any final thoughts that anybody would like to share or make?
Well, on my behalf, I just want to thank Paula and Nicole for great presentations. It gave a lot of insight for our practices and our museum work. So thank you. That was very enlightening for us. Thank you. And of course, Gabriel and Chiara for hosting. This was a lot of fun for me to do. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun for us.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you. It was really great. Thank you, both of you. So thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge.
Thank you, everyone. This was really fascinating. A lot of fun. Always fun to collaborate and share ideas. As we've seen throughout the presentations as well. It's an ongoing theme of having a dialogue.
Yeah, brilliant. Cool, great. Thank you very much. Please join us next week for the next session on epigraphic object encoding and Epidoc, which will be presented by myself, by Anna Clara Maniero Azzolini, and by Paulina Jordanova. And we'll see you then. There's 3 more weeks of this left. We've still got plenty of fun to have this semester. Thank you all, and see you soon.